starting off just a little bit lighter. We wanted to do a story ahead of the election, more of tell me something that I don't know. Which 12 years as a senator, you've been in the spotlight a long time.
Right. So something about me that you or the public doesn't know about. Well, I'm a composter. I love trees. I plant trees all over my yard. I've planted trees from little seedlings that are now 40 feet tall. Maple trees, hickory trees, oak trees.
Growing up, what did you want to be? Was it always an ophthalmologist?
A physician, probably from an early age. My dad delivered babies, and so I always knew he was out and about and out late at night delivering babies. And so I wanted to be a physician, and I knew that pretty early because I knew I had to work hard to make sure I did well in school. Even really beginning in high school, I made the decision that I was going to, try to be a good student. And then in college in particular, then you're starting to think, boy, I really have to get these grades or I won't get into medical school. So physician that was after I wanted to be a professional baseball player, but that was when I was 10. But after I kind of figured that was not going to probably happen, then I set my sights on, just being a physician.
Your dad, obviously proud of that part. As far as the political career you've led, what does he have to say about that?
We have a lot in common. We talk about politics. He never really gets too involved, either in my campaigns from the very beginning or otherwise. I ask him about things. But really, I just grew up campaigning for him and learned a lot about campaigning from being involved in his campaigns. Even as a young kid, when I was probably 8, 10, 12 years old, I would lay on the carpet listening to him on the radio, doing interviews. And even back then, even though he was just a congressman from Texas, he'd be doing interviews in Wyoming and Montana, Idaho. He'd do interviews all across the United States. And he spent a lot of time trying to connect with other people who were interested and worried about the destruction of the dollar, inflation. All those topics have now come back. Those were big topics in the 1970s, and we haven't paid as much attention to them because inflation's been lower for a long time. And now that inflation's back, a lot of the same sort of things I remember my dad talking about in the 70s are now coming back, this century.
You say you had a good childhood, kind of just growing up.
I grew up in a small town. I could ride my bike everywhere. Rode my bike to kindergarten by myself. There's usually a group of kids. You'd be out front in the driveway, and down the road would come another group of kids and another group of kids, and the group got bigger and bigger. We'd cross one major road, but there was a crossing guard there. And so I rode my bike from kindergarten through 8th grades every day of school, and rode my bike to baseball, football, you name it, everywhere we went. It was a town of about 13,000 people, but I could ride. It was a lot of freedom really for a kid, and I enjoyed it. And one of the reasons, we chose Bowling Green, because we ended up having 3 boys, and we wanted to live in a small town where we knew the people in the town. You'd meet people in the grocery store. You knew you'd meet people at church.
Mm-hmm. How often are you home?
Almost every weekend. It's a pretty busy schedule. I'm in Washington almost every week. I usually leave on Monday for Washington, come back towards the end of the week, and then I'm home over the weekend and do the same cycle. And then there's some periods of times where we're in-state more. So like the month of August, a lot of times we're here, and then I'll travel around Kentucky. And it's funny sometimes because people will criticize, why aren't you here and here? And it's like, well, I'm in 3 different places. It's a lot because people don't understand the job involves Washington as well as Kentucky. And you do have to be all over Kentucky. So I've visited almost every place in Kentucky many times. We know the roads. Just in the last 2 months, this is just ordinary stuff, not really campaigning, but just the ordinary stuff. I've probably been in 60 cities in 2 months and probably over 5,000 miles on the car. So,
12 years as a senator. You're hoping for 6 more. Do you see an end to this? I know you say you're not a career politician, but we're looking at that path.
I spent the first 18 years of my career, 20 years, as a physician. I've still continued to practice medicine, and I kind of wish we could do both. I've always been an advocate that we should allow people to continue their day job, their regular job, and that people would be more part-time legislators and not full-time. I think a lot of time is wasted. We could actually go back to having people who had a job. We could actually lower the salaries of people in Washington, have them there less long. Well, we do the opposite. What I discovered when I got there is they wouldn't let me practice medicine at all for money. So when I do surgery now, I do it for free and for charity, which is fine, but I couldn't really own my own practice and pay people because I'm not allowed to bring in any money. But I've done trips to Guatemala, I've done trips to Haiti. I've probably operated in probably somewhere between, 6 or 7 different surgery centers around Kentucky for people who don't have insurance. And I still enjoy doing that. And it is a difficult decision sometimes, between remaining in public life versus, going back to medicine. But I do think if I weren't there, I think that there's kind of a void for someone who would stand up and say, we're spending too much money. No matter how unpopular it is, I've taken that stand, and I can tell you the truth. It's funny, somebody criticized me one time for standing up against some money, and they're like, oh, you're just doing it to grandstand. And it's like, you think I like the attention that people heap on me for being the person who says, oh, we don't have the money? It's sort of being the person that's taking the stand that's not necessarily really that popular sometimes, but has to be said, because that's the fix we're in now. We're $31 trillion in debt, and it's because there weren't enough people like me standing up and saying, we shouldn't spend money we don't have.
Speaking of popularity, you're looking at Kentucky's governor who just saw his ranking, his support go up even amongst the Republicans, ranked 8th now in the country. How do you feel, especially your squabble with Anthony Fauci, how do you feel like that's put you in this race?
I guess I don't look at it that way. I look at something and try to figure out the truth, and then I go to battle for the truth. I think that the virus, the COVID virus, the evidence very strongly indicates that it came from a lab in Wuhan. I think Dr. Fauci was complicit in covering that up and still is. The reasoning, because he funded the lab. He's tried to obscure the fact that he funded it, and this isn't the first time. And people need to realize that this is a billion-dollar industry. This isn't just people who, I want to help mankind and I want to cure cancer. There's billions of dollars being exchanged in this industry, and we need to search for the truth. I don't think people purposely created the virus like, we want to kill 1 million people, but I am curious how 1 million Americans died from this, and nobody seems to be curious as to how this originated. And if it came from a lab, wouldn't we want to regulate this type of research to make sure this doesn't happen again? So this is something that I'm very, very serious about. And as far as priorities, if I win again, this is something we are going to look into, and we've already talked about investigating the origins of this virus, because this type of risky, dangerous gain-of-function research is still going on.
I know you weren't able to be at Fancy Farm. Your wife was. That was another day where there was a lot of media attention on the things that she said. Do you stand by everything that was put out there?
I thought she did a great job. I've had probably 1,000 people come up to me and said, Kelly did such a great job. You don't need to come next year. She did such a good job. But no, I think she did a fabulous job. It's been a tradition in Kentucky history for 150, 160 years. And it's a tradition of, throwing barbs back and forth. But I thought the barbs that she threw were in fun and good spirit and had a little zing to them. That's what politics is about a little bit, particularly Fancy Farm. And I think people misinterpret things. I mean, the activist on some of these issues, like, your wife is a hater or something. It's like, tell me one thing she said that was hateful about anyone. We can have a debate over whether or not we should have men in women's clothing dancing in front of your kindergartners at school and whether taxpayers should pay for that. Doesn't mean I hate men who dress in women's clothing. I just don't think it's appropriate, and I don't think my wife does either, for men in women's clothing taking their clothing off to be dancing in front of kindergartners. For goodness sakes, I think that's a very reasonable debate, but it doesn't make you a hater. This is the world we live in, though. We can't have a reasonable discussion about whether or not men in women's clothing should dance and take off their clothes in front of your kindergartner, whether that's appropriate. We just think if you bring that up, you're somehow a hater. Look, adults can do anything. I am a libertarian. I don't have anything to say about adults who want to do different things, in their personal time. And but I do have something to say when it intersects with my tax dollars and when it intersects with children. And these are important stands to take. If we have hands off, we're not allowed to talk about whether or not a 13-year-old girl should have surgery to remove her breasts without her parents' permission. Man, these are huge issues, and people are very concerned about this. People are alarmed that this is happening. This is happening in our country. People are saying that parents have no right to be involved with whether their 13-year-old girl has a double mastectomy because she thinks she's a boy. We certainly should talk about that. If you're an adult and you want to do that, I'm a libertarian, that's your business. But if you're wanting to do this to children and you're not willing to have any discussion and you're going to say the parents have no say in this, I think that is a catastrophe for society and a real injustice to children. And we should be able to take it, but it doesn't mean I hate anybody. It has nothing to do with hate. It has to do with, I'm actually concerned about those children and about whether or not they can make a mature decision that's a lifelong decision. And I think it's awful that we think we can't talk about that because somebody's going to call you a name.
Going through this campaign, your top 3 priorities.
I think the most important thing right now is actually avoiding nuclear war. And when you say something like that, people are like, oh my God, nuclear war. It sounds like, we haven't been talking about nuclear war since the 60s, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think there is some danger. There is some danger as we speak that we could accidentally get engaged with a nuclear war. And I think, nobody wants that. I don't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat, nobody wants that. But in order not to have that, I think it's important that we have voices, and I am one of those voices who believe in dialogue and diplomacy. Doesn't mean we accede to what our enemies want, but it does mean that we are listening to our adversaries and that we are engaging, that we have phone lines of deconfliction, that there's a conversation with Putin. Some people are like, oh, Putin's evil. Maybe, but at the same time, should we talk to people who we consider to be evil and have communication with them to try to prevent something catastrophic from happening? I think it's the same way with China, it's the same way with Iran, that I've been a Republican, but a Republican who is not excited about war, who thinks war is a terrible result, a last resort, and that we should have open lines of communication. So I would say the number one thing that all of us should be involved with, regardless of political party, is making sure that there's enough dialogue, that there's an escape route. It was Kennedy and others who said, if you don't have an escape route or an exit route for your enemy thinks the only way is war, that's a terrible place to box your enemy into. Doesn't mean you're sympathetic with your enemy, but it means that we have to be very careful that we don't allow our enemy to see an exit ramp.
Now, that would be the first one.
First one. The second one would be something I think people in Kentucky know that I've talked about from the very beginning, is that I think the second threat to our national security is our debt. And it's alarming, and we're now at $31 trillion. We have money supply expanding at 15% a year, and we've got inflation across the board. Gas prices up 45%, eggs up 36%, meat up over 20%. The CPI is measured by the government at least 8%, but really when you talk to people, they're worried about it really being in the mid-teens what they're spending. This debt is caused from government running a deficit and not balancing their budget. So I continue to think that that's a big threat to our currency and to our people, and I'm not alone now. I think everybody across Kentucky is feeling the pain of inflation. And I think there's, in some ways, sort of a bait and switch or a false promise from politicians who say, well, I'll give you free this, free college, free medicines, free everything. But there is a cost. And the cost comes through the debt that runs up by offering things to people that are ostensibly free, that aren't free. And in the end, we pay for it. And the irony is, the cruel irony of this is the working class, the poor, those on fixed income, retirees are the ones who pay the worst penalty because their incomes aren't allowed to adjust upwards in order to take account for inflation. So I am worried about what inflation is doing to people and the connection between that and debt, and that we need more voices. The simple voice of saying we should spend what comes in, which I think most Americans and most Kentuckians get, but a lot of people in Washington, both Republican and Democrat, don't seem to be as concerned as I am about what the debt's doing to our country.
Priority number 3.
Priority number 3, I think, is investigating the origins of the pandemic and finding out where this came from, whether it came from a laboratory, and if it did, making sure this kind of research is not allowed to go on. I think that this was a virus that in the end killed a lot of people, but the overall death rate is probably going to be about 0.3%. So not even 1%, but it still killed 1 million people, 0.3%, 1 million Americans died. They are doing research with viruses that have 50% mortality. There are viruses that can kill 50% of America but aren't very infectious naturally, that they're looking to see if they can create and make them more infectious. we had a professor, scientist from MIT came in, and he wrote in the Washington Post as an op-ed, and this is where I found out about him. He wrote that this is a death wish for civilization to monkey around with viruses that have 50% mortality and try to make them more lethal. So we have to get to the bottom of this. There's a mountain of evidence. We need to have a full-throated debate over this, hear from scientists on both sides, but there's the preponderance of the evidence coming in is that this came out of a lab. In all likelihood accidentally, but we're doing this research in America. This could happen again. This is not the first lab leak. There have been a half dozen significant lab leaks that have caused smaller pandemics. This is the first one to be worldwide, and I think this is why we had such an alarming reaction by Dr. Fauci and others that were in charge of this and funded this, is that they knew from the beginning, holy cow, this could come back, this could boomerang and come back to the people who funded it. That's why I think there's been such resistance to an investigation. But I'd say that would be the third priority I have in re-election, would be investigating the origins of the virus.
And I know people here locally, especially in Louisville, the crime. You've kind of put yourself up with Christopher 2X, partnered with him in a lot. What to do locally with our situation?
You know, I've met several of the families that have been, victims of this crime. One couple in particular lost their 14-year-old son, and then also their daughter was shot as well. I also met a woman from Lexington whose son lost both of the vision in both eyes. Not doing anything wrong. They were in their house. And so we do need to punish the people and separate the people who are doing these shootings. I was told recently by a policeman that a shooting where you drive by someone's house and shoot, and if they say no one was in the house or in the room, they're calling that criminal mischief, a traffic ticket. That's wrong. Those people need to go to jail. But defunding the police is not the answer. Getting rid of the police and saying, oh, we're not going to have any policemen. When I talk to people who've been the victims of violence in the West End, they want more police. They want more protection. And look, I have 3 kids that I raised, and I never had to really worry about them on the bus stop being shot. So I think it's inexcusable, unfair, rotten that anybody in the West End has to worry about their kids going to the bus stop. They should be safe, and we should make it so. Now, how we do that is probably more of a state and local issue than it is a federal issue. But the first thing about it is we can't be demeaning and going after the police all the time and saying the police are terrible people. The police are not killing people in the West End. It's people killing people, and the police are trying to protect the people there. And so, have there been some instances where there were problems? Yes. I was the first one to introduce the Breonna-Taylor Act to get rid of no-knock raids. So I want there to be rules. I want people to be safe. But the vast majority of murders across the country, 99.9% of the murders, are not the police killing people, it's people killing people, and 99% of the police are trying to help prevent that. They're good people. You go to church with them, they live in your neighborhood, you see them at the grocery store. They are the leaders in our community. I mean, we lost 3 policemen in Prestonsburg just 3 months ago, and it makes me sad. But when I talk to people in Louisville, I don't hear people saying, let's defund the police and get rid of the police. No, they want there to be rules, obviously, for the police, but they want more policing, more community policing, more people at the bus stop to protect their kids. And this is a real difference between the candidates. I am not for defunding the police. And I think as this comes out more and more, people are not going to be supportive of a candidate who's for defunding the police.
Well, and I will say, when I spoke with Charles Booker earlier this week, he said that was a blatant lie. That he's never actually said he wants to defund the police, he just wants alternatives. In the first debate that he had with the other Democrats in 2019, he said explicitly, they asked him about defunding the police, and he says he's been working on that for over a year. So look at the debate, and we can all determine whether it's true or not. When he was interviewed on MSNBC, he was asked that the Black Lives Matter support defunding the police. And what did he say? As soon as possible, yes, we got to get on that. Exactly right, yes. So he's just not being honest. He was all for defunding the police until he discovered nobody else was for it. So he may be changing his mind now, but he has to explain a year's worth of statements. Saying you've worked for something for over a year and now saying you never said it, those two things don't quite go together. You mentioned it real quickly with the Breonna Taylor protests. The protesters right now are trying to get those charges dropped. Where do you stand on that?
I don't know if I know enough of the facts about the charges, and I guess that's the you're talking about now the federal charges, or the attorney general chose not to prosecute.
These are
initially.
the local charges, specifically the 30 plus protesters who took on the 2nd Street Bridge. They arrested about 33 of them.
Oh, you're talking about charges against the protesters?
Yes.
I actually don't know enough to comment on those charges.
Okay. Anything that I didn't ask, I know we're running tight on time here, but was there anything else that you wanted to mention, or just another thing I don't know about you?
No, I think we hit on a lot of things, and I think that one of the things that, like even today that we came from, I am a person who's willing to look at the facts of things and work with whoever wants to work together on this. So today we announced that we passed legislation to it's called the FDA Modernization Act, and it is to try to not mandate that there's so much drug testing on dogs. And with it, I was able to work with another Booker, but Senator Booker from New Jersey, who is a progressive Democrat, and I've worked with him on criminal justice reform as well, is that I think I do work across the aisle, and sometimes I think it's not depicted as much as it possibly does happen. But in this, we're going to try to save dogs' lives and have less drug testing on dogs. But it's something that a progressive Democrat and a conservative Republican came together to work on. And there have been many of those instances. But I think sometimes we're in such a polarized world, we only hear about the controversy instead of the actual times when people do come together.
Ending on the lighter note, your favorite food in the kitchen. Do you make it? Does Kelly?
Favorite food in the kitchen would be anything in the kitchen for me. That's my problem. But no, I would say that I'm a big mushroom fan. You can put mushrooms in anything, legal mushrooms, of course. But mushrooms in anything, I would always be saying, do we have any mushrooms to add to that? It'd be even better with mushrooms. But
I'm glad I asked that question. Thank you so much, Senator. I appreciate it.
Thank you.